CFRC 101.9 FM. You're listening to Alternative Frequency. My name is Jasmine Chapman, and I'm your host this afternoon. Today on the show features an interview I had last week with Sue Donaldson and Calvin Neufeld about the prison farms and their new proposed plant-based animal sanctuary farm. It sure opened up my eyes to the world that surrounds prison farms, and I hope that it does yours too. CFRC 101.9 FM. I'm Jasmine Chapman, and I'm sitting down with two great individuals who are prison farm advocates and who are developing a new plant-based prison farm project. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourselves and tell us what drew you to the prison farm advocacy?
Well, my name is Sue Donaldson, and I'm a writer and a research associate in the philosophy department at Queen's. And so I write about animal ethics and animal politics. So I came to this issue because the federal government decided to open up the issue for public consultation once they decided that they might go ahead and reopen the farms. So it was as a result of that public consultation process that I thought, oh, okay, here's an opportunity to not just go back to the old model, but to look at a new idea for prison farms. And it turned out that Calvin and Calvin's mom, Francine, were thinking along very similar lines. And so when we realized that we had those very similar ideas, we came together to evolve our prison farms.
My name's Calvin Neufeld, and I work for, I'm a social justice advocate generally, but specifically I do work for the Suffering Eyes Project, which supports farmed animal sanctuaries across North America and internationally. So I have quite a bit of experience with sanctuaries and how they operate and what's successful, what are the challenges, what kind of models succeed best. And they tend to be the ones with strong community partnerships, really good programming as well, and often integrating education into that. And so having the experience of how sanctuaries work, what works, and of course, Sue's insights into the environmental aspects and experimenting with interspecies society, which is what we are. We are an interspecies society, and it's time we begin to recognize that and experiment with different models for our relationships with animals.
Could you first introduce this topic by giving a brief history of prison farms and how it has evolved over time?
Sure. Actually, I just recently published an article in Briar Patch magazine just this month. It traces the history of prison farms in Canada, and they began really since the earliest days of colonial settlement. And in the first penal systems that were developed, prisoners were made as part of their punishment to work. And it was meaningless, mindless work, like breaking rocks or just something absolutely senseless, because it was seen as punishment, and punishment was seen as physical pain and humiliation. So that was the origins of prison farms in Canada. And over the century, or 150 years or so, the purpose of the farms has evolved. So it originally went from just pure torture towards the prisoners to, okay, well, let's at least put the prisoners to meaningful work and have them feeding themselves and the communities during the wars. Prison farms fed the soldiers in the Great Wars. But still, a lot of it was forced labor. And then we've evolved from there to voluntary labor. So it's self-selected. The prisoners would volunteer for the work and gain meaningful life skills. So not just work, but meaningful life skills. And then eventually also introducing very small amounts of pay, but still some pay for the work. And we see there being an opportunity now to continue that trajectory, evolving further to what are we doing with our farms. I think we can actually use prison farms as a way to pave our way to a healthier, more sustainable, and more compassionate future. We can experiment with our prison farms in ways that farmers can't experiment. Margins in farming are so small. It's very hard for farmers to try a new crop or a new type of farming, but we can do this with prison farms. And that can be a model for the rest of Canada and potentially the world as well.
How important were the farms as a form of rehabilitation for the inmates?
Well, the Archambault report of 1938 identified rehabilitation as key to reintegration and public safety. So that's actually a priority for Correctional Service of Canada, or at least it should be. And offering meaningful programming that offers relevant rehabilitation is really essential. It's as important as any form of medical care or dental care. And it's directly tied to public safety. And that's in ways that medical care and dental care aren't related to public safety. So all the more important is rehabilitation.
Yeah, so it would be very strange to think that rehabilitation programming should be something that should show a profit, or that's just the wrong model for thinking about those kinds of costs in a prison system, right? Effective programming is presumably why they're there, and if prison farms are effective rehabilitation programming, then that's what we should be focused on, especially, as you say, since the costs are really insignificant.
And considering the cost of housing an inmate, for I think male inmates it's upwards of $115,000 or more per year. For female inmates, much higher, over $130,000 a year to house inmates. So by reducing recidivism, which is a result of good rehabilitation, we actually save an enormous amount of money. It doesn't even compare to the $4 million that the former government claims was being lost to the farm.
How did the abolishment of the prison farms affect the prisoners who worked with the animals?
I've heard the stories that they stayed to hug the cows until the last possible minute, who refused to load the cows onto the trucks. So they protested in the ways that they were allowed to protest, and clearly they wanted the cows to stay, they wanted the farms to stay. That's clear.
We don't want to sentimentalize that, because there are also stories about abuse of the animals on the prison farms. So obviously the relationship was very important to some individuals, but we have to remember that it's filled with conflict, right? So there are moments of caring and connection with the animals, but in dairy farm there are also moments where you are forcibly inseminating cows, or you're stealing the calves away from their mums and listening to them cry and call out for one another. And there's an abattoir that continues to run on prison property, and prisoners were involved in actually killing these animals that they had formed a bond with. So there's a complexity to this question about the human-animal relationships on the farm, and one of the reasons that we have come up with the model we have is because we wanted to pull what was positive in those relationships. So there can be something profoundly positive in those relationships, especially if you think about so many prisons have forms of sanctuary or dog and cat rescues, and there's actually research emerging from those about the importance of these as therapeutic programs. And one thing is that prisoners see in these animals others like them who are sort of outcasts in society, or strays, or needing somebody to believe in them and to take a chance on them. And so there's this strong potential for identification and for relationship. And of course, with animals, they're not judgmental the way other humans are about crimes we may have committed in our past. And so again, there's a deep possibility there for relationship development for people who've sort of shut themselves down from relating to other humans because they've had bad experiences or because they've just become emotionally cut off. So there is that crucial dimension, but there's something very contradictory about trying to do that through something like a dairy farming model that involves harming animals and ultimately killing animals. Whereas doing this through a model where animals are there as part of a sanctuary and part of contributing to a farm system, but not by giving their lives, but just by being there and do what they naturally do. So there we have a win-win situation, right? We get rid of the contradiction inherent in the dairy farm model, but I think we pull what was positive from that model in terms of this therapeutic potential of these relationships. So,
was there even any rehabilitation program that replaced the prison farms?
There was no effective programming that the farms were replaced with to continue prioritizing rehabilitation. There's no evidence that any meaningful programs were replaced. The farms here in Kingston were replaced by a laundry facility, And apparently even the folding is automated. All that the prisoners do is push buttons. So that's really, I think, turning prisoners into cogs in a machine rather than really focusing on rehabilitating them and what's good for their mental, physical, and social health. Now that we're considering bringing the farms back, what kind of farming would really constitute the most effective form of rehabilitation for inmates? Do we go back to the old model, or do we consider different models and determine which is the most feasible, both in terms of the environment, financially responsible, and that lends itself to rehabilitation? And this brings open the question of what were the problems with the former model.
And what were the problems with the old dairy farm model?
We, among many other people in Kingston and in surrounding areas, feel that the dairy model doesn't really serve that purpose as effectively as other agricultural models, particularly healthy, innovative, sustainable plant-based farming, which could be complemented by farmed animal sanctuary and bring that pen herd of cows back to the prison, and they would contribute natural fertilizers to an integrated farming system and would provide potentially a basis for a very effective humane education program which could benefit inmates and also potentially the broader community.
You have a new proposed plant-based farm model, so can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. So the idea is simply that the farms would be focused on creating plant-based foods rather than animal agriculture. And we know that that's the efficient way, of course, to feed humans. It's much more effective to simply grow crops, legumes, fruits, and vegetables and feed them to humans directly. If we go through animals to create animal protein, it's a far more wasteful process in terms of the land required for growing soy and corn, the water required, and as well, of course, the greenhouse gas contribution of animal agriculture has been highlighted by the United Nations as a key problem for moving towards sustainable economies. So the idea is, why go through this process of feeding plants to animals in this extremely wasteful pyramid to create animal protein? Let's just look at the plant base and start there. And so, of course, farms could grow depending on the location. In Kingston, of course, this is very good farmland here that the farms have, and they could grow a wide variety of not just fruits and vegetables, but legume crops and grain crops and possibly nut orchards and fruit orchards. So again, the idea would be to be producing a range of food that would be consumed in the prisons and also be available to donate to kitchens and food programs and so on. This food would, of course, be healthy. We all know this is what we need to be eating, fruits and vegetables. It'd be far healthier food production. It's much less costly to initiate programs of this sort. They don't have anything like the overhead involved in establishing dairy farms and the kind of equipment that's involved in the purchase of the animals and all of those things. So it's much more feasible on a cost basis. And there's this potential, given the nature of the land in Kingston that's attached to the farms, if we move towards really progressive, sustainable, plant-based farms, those farms would be not, big monocultural crop farms. They would be much more mixed farms that are established with the relationships with the wild animals in the area in mind. So how do you do, plant-based farming that actually supports pollinators instead of destroying them, that actually provides some place for wild birds and other animals rather than just thinking of them as nuisances in the farm system? How do you do it so that it's sensitive to native plants growing in the region, to the wetlands that are associated with the Collins Bay. So this would be, the model is plant-based, but with all of these add-ons in terms of, okay, well, how can we connect this to, creating a more sustainable Kingston? How could these farms actually be part of green corridors, that link the countryside and the city, so that animals, including pollinators and other animals, can move freely between these areas.
And it's also very important to point out that we're not talking about just putting in a few gardens. Mm-hmm. So plant-based agriculture is not little garden here, little sort of homesteading kind of style gardening. We're talking about agriculture. Full-on agriculture, putting that land into use, and consulting with experts, and getting all the input that we need to look at this in a really wholesome way and on a large scale, to really produce as much food as we can produce sustainably on this land, the healthiest food that we can produce on that land, determined by the different climates, because there are prison farms there were prison farms in different cities across Canada with entirely different climates. So there's no one-size-fits-all model, but we can certainly draw on the resources that we have, the human capital, and our knowledge-based economy, which Kingston has strived to develop its knowledge-based economy for quite some time now, and this is right in line with that.
And if we get really creative about, a new model of prison farms, ecologically sound plant-based farming, then you start to see real potential, both for prisoners, but also for the larger community, right? So in terms of producing really healthy foods for within the prison system, and to donate outside of the prison system to food banks and kitchens and so on, to effectively manage that land that is under correctional services. So a lot of that land, around Collins Bay, for example, is ecologically sensitive habitat, and so to have a program that really pursues plant-based farming, but in a way that is sensitive to that location, so contributing to Kingston sustainability, contributing to local food, healthy local food, and food security. So when you start to bring in all those dimensions, then whatever the cost of the program, and it's just not significant, but you start to see those huge benefits and offshoots, and that's, we need to take that larger perspective.
And what types of skills would this new model teach inmates?
Yes, and by sort of looking at that cutting edge of where farming is going and can go, the kinds of meaningful work and skills that prisoners could learn working on those farms is also highly relevant, and in terms of opportunities for them upon release, and just opportunities for personal growth and development. We're talking about meaningful skills, learning science of soil management and organic farming and permaculture techniques, and various kinds of sort of cutting edge sustainable farming practices.
That was one of the reasons that the Harper government cited in shutting down the farms, is it doesn't teach employable skills. Mm-hmm. So they're saying that these inmates are not getting jobs in the agricultural sector, and certainly not in the dairy sector. And one of the changes that has happened over the last couple of decades, really, I suppose, is that the dairy industry has been largely automated. So it's unfair to say that agriculture doesn't teach valuable skills or even employable skills. But if we're looking at a variety of models, the dairy industry is just increasingly automated. So jobs will be harder to find. So are we training inmates in dairy production? Or are we training inmates in the general life skills, and then also seeing where the future of farming is headed? And there are jobs. The organic plant-based sector is booming. Mm-hmm. Green technologies are booming. There are jobs there. So we can actually train prisoners in a way that will result in employable skills upon release.
In conversations I've had with prisoner advocates, and they've talked about to me about what prisoners think about the work they do in the prisons and what matters to them about work programs and opportunities. And some of the things that get emphasized are basically the kinds of questions you have to be able to answer before a parole board when the conversation is happening about your release. And the prison farms gave opportunity for prisoners to show, first of all, that they, so this is work where you have to show up every day and do it. You can't miss. So there's just a responsibility, daily responsibility to the work and commitment. There's often it involves doing tasks that aren't highly supervised. So you're often sort of working on your own, and so it's an opportunity for prisoners to demonstrate that trust and responsibility. As you mentioned, there's teamwork and cooperation involved in various tasks. There's also in these programs, prisoners developed relationships with people outside of outside of the prisons. So there were local farmers involved in the program, and that's another really crucial thing is making those connections and developing relationships outside of the closed prison system, and again demonstrating responsibility in those relationships, and having those connections to build on when you are released. So I think there's a wide range of kinds of skills there, and development or demonstration of responsibility and cooperative engagement that go beyond the specific skills, concrete skills involved in any given activity. And a number of people said that the prison farms sort of had that potential and fulfilled that.
And there was certainly in the survey that the government, Liberal government, put out seeking public input, they want to know from employers how many employers would be interested in hiring an offender upon their release versus how that offender having gone through, say, the farm or agricultural program. And there are many, many employers who would actually have a strong preference for an inmate that has been through a program like that, because they can see that they have documented responsibility and experience, not so much job-specific experience, but they've demonstrated that they can be responsible, work hard, stay committed to something. And so there's that in itself increases their likelihood of being employed upon release.
There are many people who say that prison farms take advantage of inmates and turn them into slaves. What is your response to that opinion?
Well, I'm glad you raised the kind of larger question about prisons. I mean, speaking here for myself, I am strongly support prison reform movements that move towards the end of prison, move towards different models of responding to crime and rehabilitation in society. And so I think a question is, would something like implementing plant-based farming in prisons mean that we're supporting the idea of prisons as they exist? No. It's just saying that if we're going to have prisons, as we are for the foreseeable future, what is a good model for going forward, and potentially starting to break down some of those walls between prisons and society. And we think that this model of plant-based farming, connected to the community in various ways, either through, land stewardship programs, through food processing programs, through just education, either humane education or ecological farming education, that these are all ways of starting to break down that wall a little bit and move towards maybe eventually a different and more progressive of model for society in general. So we see that potential down the road. We think this is a good step towards.
And of course, it's not forced labor. No prisoners are forced to do this work. It used to be under old models of prison agriculture, but they're not forced. And so if we were to actually really include the prisoners' voices here, which I would love to do, I feel quite conflicted speaking about prisons and prisoners on this side of the walls, and their voices are not heard. But what we have heard of their voices is that they enjoyed their experiences with the farms, they benefited from their experiences with the animals, and I would bet that if we were to sit down with them and say, between the two scenarios, which would you rather be involved in? Did it what were the low points of the work before? Separating the calves, shipping them off to where? What's not talked about is the slaughterhouse. Most male calves are slaughtered, and most of the female calves will go into dairy production, and again, their lives will be cut short in their youth. So I think that those would have been the parts of the job that would have been the least beneficial, the least enjoyable, the hardest emotionally for the inmates. So can we have all of the benefits that they had before without those downsides? I think we can. Well, of course we can. It's just, will that decision be made?
How do people get in contact with you if they want more information about this new proposed evolution of prison farms?
Our website, evolveourprisonfarms.ca, and we invite everybody to contact us. Let us know your thoughts. Prisoners as well, if anybody's listening to this, write to us. I don't think there's a mailing address on that website, but my name is Calvin Neufeld. If you go to calvinneufeld.com, you can send a letter to me, or send, request through email, request a mailing address, and we'll certainly arrange that. But we do want to hear from as many members of the community and the prisons as possible.
I want to thank Sue Donaldson and Calvin Neufeld for coming in and talking to me about this issue. If you have any questions, you can contact them. And if you would like to voice your support for this new proposal, they urge you to contact the MP, Mark Garrison, and Minister Ralph Goodale.